Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world of flickering torchlight and damp stone corridors, where the air smells faintly of smoke, wool, and something that's probably been cooking a little too long over the hearth. You step carefully along a muddy path, boots sinking just slightly with every movement, as distant bells from a monastery drift across the cold evening air. Somewhere nearby, a horse shifts, leather creaks, and voices murmur behind thick wooden doors. This is medieval life, and when it comes to dating, well, let's just say you probably wouldn't last a week here. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always find it oddly comforting knowing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the edge of a small village gathering, the kind that happens after a long day of labour fields tilled, animals fed, and hands washed in cold water that never quite feels warm enough. The fire crackles at the centre, casting long, wavering shadows. People laugh softly, trade stories, and pretend they're not watching each other quite as closely as they actually are. Because this is where dating happens, or at least the medieval version of it. You notice quickly that nothing here feels casual. There's no easy confidence, no bold approach. Instead, everything unfolds in careful glances and quiet proximity. You catch someone looking your way just for a second, and then they're suddenly very interested in their cup of ale. Smooth, truly timeless behaviour. In medieval society, especially among peasants, social gatherings like this were one of the few acceptable places where young people could interact. Work dominated most of the day, and privacy was about as rare as a perfectly clean tunic. Historians widely agree that festivals, markets, and communal feasts played a crucial role in courtship, giving people a rare chance to meet beyond the constant supervision of family. But even here, you're not exactly free. Parents linger nearby, neighbours notice everything, and the church notices even more. You can almost feel its presence in the background, like a quiet reminder that every choice you make might have consequences, spiritual or otherwise. No pressure. Still, people find ways. You shift a little closer to that person who glanced at you earlier. Not too close, this isn't modern dating after all, but just enough that you might exchange a few words. Maybe something safe, like commenting on the weather, which, judging by the damp chill in the air, is not exactly winning any awards tonight. They respond. It's awkward, a bit stiff, but there's something there, a shared moment, brief and fragile. And in a world where marriages are often arranged or heavily influenced by family interests, even this small exchange feels surprisingly significant. Among the nobility, things look a bit different but not necessarily easier. Courtly love, the romantic ideal you might have heard about, often involves elaborate gestures, poetry, and admiration from afar. Sounds dreamy, right? Except it's usually directed towards someone you're not actually allowed to marry. So essentially, medieval flirting comes with built-in emotional complications. Very efficient. You glance around the fire again, noticing how people position themselves. A little closer here, a little further there. It's like a quiet dance, one where the rules are unspoken but deeply understood. No one says, "Hey, I like you." Instead, they linger. They listen. They laugh just a bit more than necessary. And then there are the tiny risks. A glance held too long, a word spoken too softly. In a tight-knit village, even the smallest hint of affection can turn into gossip by morning. And gossip, in this world, carries real weight. It can shape reputations, influence families, and in some cases, decide futures. Historians still argue whether medieval people experienced romance in the same emotional way we do today, or if practical concerns like land, survival, and duty always came first. But standing here, watching these quiet interactions unfold, it's hard to believe that the human instinct to connect wasn't just as strong back then. The fire crackles. Someone tells a joke that's probably been told for the last 100 years, and you find yourself smiling a little more easily now. Because even in this cold, watchful world, Something warm flickers beneath the surface, and as the night deepens and the shadows stretch just a little longer, you begin to realize that medieval dating isn't boring at all. It's just quieter, slower, a little more dangerous, and maybe, in its own strange way, a lot more meaningful. By the time the village fire begins to settle into a lower, redder glow, you start to understand that affection here is never just about affection. It drifts through the air, yes, in shy smiles and careful silences, but it also moves through sacks of grain, strips of land, family names, and the rather unromantic question of who owns which cow. Medieval love has a habit of arriving wrapped in logistics, very dreamy logistics, naturally, but logistics all the same. You leave the gathering with the rest of the villagers, following the narrow track between dark cottages where smoke slips from roof holes and the ground stays damp no matter how politely you ask it not to. Somewhere a dog barks once, half-heartedly, as if even it is too tired for drama. Tomorrow, work begins before sunrise again, which means that if two people are interested in one another, they do not have endless evenings to see where things go. Medieval courtship tends to move under the shadow of practical reality, because survival is not an abstract concept here. It is breakfast, it is winter, it is whether the roof still holds when the rain starts again. That is why marriage, for many people, is not simply a private matter of the heart. It is a household decision, a labour agreement, and sometimes a careful negotiation between families. Among peasants, a marriage often means combining workforces, resources, and social ties. A strong spouse can mean more hands in the field, more security in old age, more stability when harvests turn mean. One well-known historical reality is that medieval marriages, especially for the lower classes, were closely tied to economics and household survival, not just romance. Love may be welcome, but oats do not thresh themselves. You can almost hear the conversation that happens the next morning in a smoky cottage. A mother kneads coarse bread dough while wondering whether the blacksmith's nephew has steady enough work. A father says little at first, then eventually mutters that a girl needs a husband who can keep a roof patched and a pig fed. No one asks whether he writes charming poetry, mainly because he does not, and even if he did, poetry is not especially useful when your chicken coop collapses in February. Still, the practical side does not erase feeling. It merely presses against it, shaping it. If you are young and interested in someone, you learn to read signs hidden inside ordinary life. Who walks you home from the market, who saves you a place at the feast table, who offers help carrying a bundle of wood that you absolutely could have carried yourself. Thank you very much, but suddenly do not mind sharing. Medieval romance is often tucked inside acts of usefulness. It is less I brought you roses, more I repaired your gate hinge and tried not to make a big deal about it. Honestly, that still works. For the nobility, the same tension between affection and advantage exists, only dressed in better fabric. A noble marriage might secure land, settle disputes, strengthen alliances, or improve a family's political standing. If you are the daughter of a minor lord, your future may be discussed in chambers with candles burning low over parchment, while men with rings on their fingers talk about inheritance, as though your heart were a side note scribbled in the margin. Aristocratic marriages were frequently arranged or strongly directed by family interests, especially when property and status were involved. Love, if it appears, is expected to arrive later, like an underfunded guest showing up halfway through the feast. And yet, even here, people still find ways to chase tenderness through the cracks. You might exchange glances in a hall during supper, under the stern gaze of a mother who misses very little. You might hear a song performed by a travelling minstrel and privately decide that yes, that absolutely counts as an emotional message, even if it was technically for the whole room. Courtly culture, especially in the high Middle Ages, develops a language of admiration and longing that can feel surprisingly familiar. Beautiful people in expensive sleeves pretending not to be devastated by eye contact. Humanity remains consistent. There is even a curious medieval custom called hand fasting, often described as a form of betrothal or trial union in some places and periods. though historians still argue whether it was as widespread or as informal as later stories suggest. The image is irresistible. Though two people joining hands, making promises before witnesses, the future still uncertain, but briefly held between their palms. Whether hand-fasting functioned as a binding marriage in all cases is debated, but the idea reveals something important. Even in a world of legal structures and family negotiations, people clearly long for rituals that feel personal, immediate, and human. Then there are stranger details, because the Middle Ages never entirely miss a chance to be surprising. In some regions, pieces of clothing, belts, or embroidered tokens could carry romantic meaning, and young people might exchange small keepsakes as signs of attachment. It is sweet, in a slightly wool-heavy way. Imagine receiving a little favour from someone you like and then trying to act normal about it for the next 6 weeks. Impossible. Entirely impossible. You pass the manor fields the next afternoon and see exactly how these questions of marriage and livelihood overlap. A widow works with her grown son. A newly married couple shares the labour of hauling water. A girl who has reached marrying age is suddenly spoken of in a new tone, as though she has quietly become both beloved daughter and future contract. No one says it bluntly, but everyone knows time matters, youth matters, fertility matters, reputation matters most of all. The church, of course, stands at the centre of all this like a patient, watchful stone giant. By the later medieval period, the church exerts major influence over marriage, insisting more clearly on consent as a necessary element of a valid union. That is one of the more striking historical facts here, however imperfectly applied in practice. Medieval canon law increasingly emphasized that both parties had to consent to marriage. That does not turn the age into a paradise of free choice. Obviously, families still pressure, class still constrains, and women especially face limited power. But the principle exists, and that principle matters. So beneath all the bargaining and planning, there remains a stubborn space where two people might still choose, maybe not freely in the modern sense, maybe not without consequences, but enough to make the whole thing feel less mechanical than it first appears. You begin to see that medieval dating secrets are not just about hidden meetings or sly glances. They're about this constant negotiation between feeling and function, between desire and duty, between the person who makes your pulse quicken and the person your father says owns 3 good strips of barley land. And as evening folds back over the village again, with the bells sounding the hour and smoke drifting flat beneath the cold sky, you realize that romance in the medieval world is never floating free. It is stitched into work, inheritance, weather, hunger, and hope, which makes every small gesture of real affection feel oddly radiant, like candlelight in a drafty room, fragile, warm, and a little miraculous for surviving it all. The next day unfolds beneath a pale sky the colour of watered milk, and by now you've learned that in the medieval world, almost nothing romantic is ever said directly, if it can instead be wrapped in symbolism, stitched into cloth, hidden inside a song, or passed along in a glance so brief it might plausibly be mistaken for a blink. Which, to be fair, is one way to keep things interesting. If modern dating has read receipts and typing indicators, medieval dating has ribbons, feast day choreography, and the emotional turbulence of someone handing you an apple in public. You cross the village green just after midday, when the market is thinning and the more practical business of buying onions, salt, and rough cloth begins to give way to looser conversation. A few musicians have arrived, not especially polished, but perfectly good by local standards, which mostly means they know enough tunes to keep people from noticing the stew. Around you, voices mix with the cluck of hens, the creak of cartwheels, and the occasional bell from the church tower. The air smells of damp straw, wood smoke, and bread that has seen better centuries, and it is here, in this ordinary bustle, that people begin the very delicate business of sending signals. You notice first how gifts move. Not grand gifts, obviously. No velvet jewel boxes, no dramatic balcony speeches. Medieval courtship, especially among ordinary people, often relies on small, manageable offerings, food, ribbons, carved trinkets, gloves, kerchiefs, maybe a sprig of something sweet-smelling if the season allows it. A mainstream historical fact is that tokens and love gifts were a recognized part of courtship in many medieval communities, particularly among the better off and in literary culture, where favors exchanged between admirers carried emotional meaning. Even outside noble circles, simple objects could function as quiet declarations. A ribbon tied a certain way, a piece of embroidery worked by hand, a cap passed along with suspiciously selective generosity. These are not just things, they are messages. You can practically see the mental arithmetic happening on both sides. Did that mean something? Was that for me specifically, are we now, in a deeply medieval sense, sort of a situation? The uncertainty is eternal. Among nobles and in courtly settings, tokens become even more elaborate. A knight might wear a lady's favour in a tournament, perhaps a sleeve or scarf, which sounds very romantic until you imagine trying to look dignified while carrying another person's embroidered linen into a mock combat event. Still, the point is clear, public display matters. The token says I admire someone, and that admiration has an audience. Courtly love traditions made gifts, favours, and poetic gestures central to aristocratic flirtation, even when the exact emotional sincerity behind them could be somewhere between profound devotion and very stylish performance. And then there are songs. Songs everywhere. Love songs, ballads, teasing songs. Songs with enough plausible deniability to let everyone enjoy them while pretending they're not pointed at anyone in particular. You stand near the edge of a feast as a travelling singer begins a tune about longing, springtime, and the pain of distance, which is medieval code for someone in this room is absolutely going through it. Music becomes one of the safest containers for emotion because it allows feeling to hover in the air without requiring confession. If you can't say what you mean outright, you can always hum it, preferably while looking at the floor and hoping the right person notices. Historians still argue whether the ideals of courtly love reflected actual social behaviour very often, or whether they mainly remained a literary and aristocratic fantasy. That debate lingers because medieval texts are full of longing, symbolic affection, and stylized devotion, but lived reality, especially for common people, was often harsher and more practical. And yet, even if the poetry exaggerates, it must exaggerate around something recognizable. People do not invent whole emotional languages unless the feeling underneath already exists. You start noticing the choreography of proximity too, at church festivals, harvest celebrations, Saints' Day fairs, and weddings. Young people often have more room to circulate, not freedom, exactly, but movement. Enough to end up near someone at the dance, enough to exchange a look while drawing water, enough to walk the same lane home, just slowly enough for conversation. Medieval communities did allow courtship to happen in communal spaces, particularly during feast days and festive gatherings, where supervised sociability could still leave room for personal connection. The secret is that it is not really private, just disguised. One especially charming and slightly ridiculous tidbit from the period is the use of certain foods and herbs in romantic customs or beliefs. Apples, nuts, and even specific flowers could carry associations with love or fertility. In some folk traditions, dream rituals involving herbs or cakes were supposed to reveal your future spouse, which means that after a full day of hauling water and cleaning rushes off the floor, you might still be out here putting rosemary under your pillow and hoping destiny files the proper paperwork overnight. It is sweet. Really, slightly chaotic, but sweet. You pass a young woman near a stall of dyed thread, and she receives a small folded scrap of cloth from a boy trying very hard to look like he's merely discussing wool prices. No one else comments. That is another secret of medieval flirting. Everyone sees more than they admit, and social mercy sometimes takes the form of pretending not to notice. As long as the gesture stays within acceptable bounds, a community may quietly allow these exchanges to happen. There is almost a collective understanding that youth must find some way to be young, even under watchful eyes and heavier rules. The language of signal extends beyond gifts. Clothing matters, grooming matters, a cleaner hood, a brighter belt, a carefully laced kirtle, a comb run through hair with unusual dedication. These are all forms of announcement. In a world with limited wardrobes and much practical dress, Even modest efforts stand out. You're not just dressed, you're making an argument that says, in effect, I may smell faintly of smoke like everyone else, but tonight I am doing my best. And beneath it all, there is risk. A gift can be misread, a song can be noticed by the wrong ears, a token accepted too warmly can lead to gossip, assumptions, or awkward conversations involving parents who suddenly appear to have opinions on everything. The village remembers, the manor watches, the church listens from behind stone walls and lit candles. Even innocent courtship exists under scrutiny. Yet perhaps that is exactly why these signals feel so charged. The smaller the freedom, the more meaningful each little act becomes. By late afternoon, clouds gather low and silver over the fields, and you find yourself thinking about how intimate all this is, precisely because it is indirect. No one here is oversharing over wine in a candlelit restaurant. Instead, someone offers you the choicest bit of cheese at supper. Someone keeps a place beside them on the bench. Someone remembers a detail you mentioned 3 market days ago. Medieval romance hides itself inside memory, utility, timing, and objects small enough to fit in a sleeve. You follow the lane back past the chapel wall, boots brushing wet grass, and hear laughter from somewhere ahead. It is soft, quickly hushed, then soft again. Maybe a pair of young people lingering 1 minute longer than they should. Maybe just friends. Maybe the beginning of something no one can name yet because naming things in this world makes them heavier. You smile to yourself and keep walking. Because the great surprise of medieval dating is not that it is strange, though it is. It is that it is also familiar in all the important ways. People still send signals. They still overthink them. They still treasure tiny evidence that the feeling might be mutual. And under the bells, under the rules, under the damp wool and drifting smoke, that little current of hope moves on, quietly, carefully, like a secret carried from hand to hand. By now the pattern begins to settle around you like evening mist over a ploughed field. Courtship in the medieval world is never just between 2 people. It is between 2 people, their families, their neighbours, the parish priest, the woman who sells onions and somehow knows everything before it happens, and at least one old man who claims not to care while noticing absolutely everything. Romance here does not bloom in private. It grows in public, under rules, under rumour, and under the steady pressure of other people's expectations, which, in its own way, is enough to make even holding hands feel like a criminal conspiracy. You walk toward the church on a feast day morning, and the village is already awake with movement. Shoes scrape over packed earth, a cartwheel groans, someone is shaking straw from a cloak. Bells spill down from the tower in slow, familiar waves, and people gather in their best clothing, best, in this case, meaning slightly less worn and perhaps only a modest amount of mud. This is one of the places where courtship can happen in plain sight, and because it happens in plain sight, everyone becomes an amateur detective. A well-known historical fact is that the medieval church increasingly shaped the rules around marriage and sexual behaviour, especially from the High Middle Ages onward. Priests preached against illicit unions, condemned secret relationships, and tried, with varying success, to steer people toward approved marriage. Public bans announcements read before a wedding were eventually used in many places to make intended marriages known, partly to prevent unlawful matches, which means that even your romantic future may be announced to half the village while you stand there pretending not to feel perceived. Very relaxing. You stand near the chapel door and feel all those invisible lines pressing in. Social rank matters. Family reputation matters. Whether you have a decent dowry matters. Whether your parents get along with their parents matters. Even timing matters. If a household cannot spare a daughter yet, or if a son has not secured land or work, affection may have to sit very quietly for a while, like a guest who knows it has overstayed. And then there is gossip, that eternal medieval telecommunications network. If you speak to the same person too often after Vespers, someone notices. If you linger outside a doorway too long, someone notices. If you exchange a token, or walk home by the same path twice in a week, someone notices and adds embroidery. A whispered rumour in a medieval village is not trivial entertainment. It can affect marriage prospects, trust, and family standing. Reputation is a kind of currency here, and once it slips from your hand, it does not always come back polished. You can almost watch rumour forming in real time. A girl laughs at something a boy says near the well. Nothing scandalous, just laughter, quick and bright in the cold air. Two older women glance at one another. One raises an eyebrow the way only someone with decades of village experience can. By tomorrow, the story may involve moonlight, vows, and at least one invented detail about a ribbon. Humanity, as always, remains wildly committed to making things worse for fun. So people become strategic. Courtship must be careful enough to protect honour while still allowing warmth to exist. A walk home after a feast might happen in a group first, then slowly narrow until only two remain a few paces behind. A conversation might begin in broad daylight under many eyes, and continue later in fragments, one sentence near the bake oven, another at the sheep pen, a third while passing tools. Medieval romance often survives by breaking itself into harmless-looking pieces. No single moment is enough to condemn you, but together they begin to mean something. Among the nobility, the scrutiny can be even sharper. A lord's daughter is not merely herself, she is inheritance, alliance, prestige, and family strategy in a gown. Her conduct is watched not only by relatives but by servants, retainers, and visiting households. A nobleman may have more freedom of movement, but his actions still ripple through politics and obligation. Historians still argue whether aristocratic young people had more personal room in practice than formal records suggest, or whether later literature romanticized their emotional freedom. But whether you are in a manor hall or a village lane, the principle is similar. Your heart is never the only party at the table. One of the more surprising little tidbits from medieval life is the role of matchmakers and informal intermediaries. Not always official, not always glamorous, but certainly useful. A relative, servant, friend, or neighbour might carry messages, test a family's mood, or quietly discover whether interest is mutual. The medieval world has no dating apps, but it does have aunties with opinions and astonishing efficiency. Honestly, not that different, just more wool. You see this at work during an evening meal in the manor kitchen, where servants move between benches with practiced speed, and an older woman casually asks a younger one whether she enjoyed the harvest feast. Casual is doing a lot of work there. Another servant mentions just in passing that the miller's son has steady hands and good habits. Someone else suppresses a smile. A possibility is being floated into the room like steam from the pot, if it lands well. The conversation continues another day. If not, everyone pretends it was only ever about bread. The rules of the church add another layer of tension. Marriage is supposed to be lawful, consensual, and not within prohibited degrees of kinship, which becomes surprisingly complicated in small communities where everyone seems to be related to everyone else by blood, marriage, or shared goat history. Canon law could make certain unions invalid, and local knowledge of family ties mattered more than any romantic impulse. Imagine finally finding someone you like and then discovering a priest has concerns about your cousin map. Crushing, quietly crushing. And yet, despite the pressure, or maybe because of it, tenderness keeps appearing in these tiny, stubborn ways. A cloak offered when the wind turned sharp, a seat saved on a bench, a pause at the churchyard gate just long enough for one extra sentence. These gestures matter because they risk interpretation. They say, I see you, and I am willing to be seen seeing you. In a culture where public appearance is everything, that is no small thing. You begin to understand why medieval love stories are filled with longing, not just because longing is poetic, though it certainly is, but because longing is practical in a world where immediate fulfillment is rare. Desire learns patience here. It learns coded speech, steady attention, and how to survive on very little. It also learns resilience. People find ways to express care even when every surrounding structure seems determined to convert feeling into procedure. As dusk returns again, the village settles into its familiar palette of ember red, brown wool, and deepening blue shadow. Somewhere beyond the cottages, A couple of voices speak low near a hedge, then fall silent as footsteps pass. In the manor yard, a servant looks once toward a lit window and then away. At the chapel, candles burn in front of a painted saint whose expression suggests he has seen all this before, and probably has. The secret that surprises you most is that medieval dating is not only about hidden romance, it is about navigation, about learning the map of rules and rumour and finding, somehow, a narrow footpath through them. Every glance must pass inspection, every choice has witnesses, every hope wears plain clothes so no one can accuse it of vanity. But hope remains. It persists in smoky rooms, under chapel bells, in crowded kitchens and muddy lanes. It survives being watched. It survives being discussed. It survives even the onion cellar. Barely, perhaps, but still. And as night folds over the roofs and the last bits of daylight drain from the road, you carry that thought with you that in a world so crowded with judgment, even the smallest act of affection becomes brave. By the time the last feast day chatter fades and the village settles into that familiar medieval hush of creaking beams, dying embers, and distant animal sounds, you begin to feel the softer edge of all this. Not the rules, not the bargaining, not the rumours humming through the lanes like determined little flies, but the quieter truth underneath them. Because for all the constraints of medieval life, for all the family pressure and church oversight and relentless practicality, people still reach for one another. They still do it with caution, certainly, and usually while pretending they are not doing it at all, but they do it. And somehow that makes the whole world feel warmer, even when the draft under the door insists otherwise. You walk now along the outer edge of the village where the last cottages give way to fields darkening under a deep blue sky. The air carries the smell of damp earth and chimney smoke. Above you, stars begin to appear between slow-moving clouds, and behind you, one by one, household lights dim to pinpoints. It is the kind of evening where the whole world seems to exhale. Somewhere in the distance, a bell marks the hour, not urgently, just enough to remind everyone that time is passing, as it always does, whether love has sorted itself out or not. Inconvenient, really. Time has no respect for emotional suspense. And yet this is where medieval romance becomes most human. Not in the grand tournament favour, not in the arranged discussion over land, not even in the carefully supervised feast day glance. It lives most clearly here, in the small consistency of care. The person who notices you are cold and shifts closer on the bench. The one who saves you the fresher loaf end, which in this century is practically a sonnet. The one who remembers your mother's cough, your father's bad knee, the way you dislike the smoke near the hearth, the fact that you always look up when the bells ring. In a world built on hardship, tenderness often shows itself through attention. A well-known historical fact is that medieval households, whether peasant or noble, were built around shared labour and mutual dependence. Marriage was not imagined primarily as private emotional fulfilment, but as a working partnership. And yet, because people lived so closely together and relied so heavily on one another, affection could be woven deeply into daily tasks. Love did not need to stand apart from ordinary life to be real. Very often, it was ordinary life. If someone carried water with you in sleet, mended your torn sleeve by candlelight, or remembered to leave you the warm spot near the fire, that counted for something. Quite a lot, actually. You think back to all the signs you've seen over these long, muddy, bell-filled days. The ribbon folded into a hand, the suspiciously meaningful apple, the conversation stretched over chores, the awkward glances by the church door, the way rumour prowled behind every smile. Medieval dating, if you can even call it that without making the parish priest frown in advance, is not secret because people are especially mysterious. It is secret because secrecy gives fragile feelings room to grow before the world starts judging them. And in a place where everyone knows your business by sunrise, that little pocket of privacy is precious. There are, of course, still surprises tucked into the edges of the story. One quirky detail from medieval folklore is that dream divination and love charms never entirely disappear. No matter how stern official religion becomes, People continue trying little rituals to discover whom they might marry or whether affection will be returned. A cake, an herb, a whispered phrase, a charm tucked beneath linen, small acts of hope disguised as custom. You can picture it easily. Someone who has spent all day helping churn butter or clean rushes off the floor, still finding enough optimism to ask destiny for a hint before bed. Medieval people really do understand the desire for spoilers. Historians still argue whether the emotional experience of love in the Middle Ages should be understood as fundamentally similar to modern romance, or whether later centuries have projected their own ideals backward. The language changes, the expectations change, the legal and religious frameworks change, but standing here at the edge of the fields, listening to the soft rustle of wind through winter grass, it feels impossible to believe the core feeling is alien, the longing to be chosen, the anxiety of waiting, the thrill of being noticed, the quiet comfort of someone walking beside you in the dark. Those things do not belong to one century. They travel. You pause near a low stone wall where the cold has settled into the rock, and from one of the cottages behind you comes the muffled sound of laughter, quickly softened, then replaced by the ordinary music of homeward settling. A pot moved on the hearth, someone sweeping the floor before sleep. That, perhaps, is the true setting of medieval love, not the dramatic castle balcony people like to imagine, though admittedly the aesthetic is excellent. It is the shared bench, the late chore, the whispered sentence before parting, the comfort of familiar footsteps at the end of a hard day. Romance here survives because it learns humility. It learns to live in little spaces, and perhaps that is why it feels unexpectedly moving. The medieval world is not gentle. It is cold, uncertain, and often ruled by necessity. Illness visits without invitation. Harvests fail. Winters linger. Children are watched. Workers are tired. And futures are negotiated before feelings are fully spoken. Yet still people manage to create tenderness. They tuck it into customs, into labour, into feast days and churchyards and scraps of cloth. They borrow moments where they can. They become fluent in half-signals, in patience, in courage disguised as politeness. As the final lights in the village burn lower, you imagine two people parting at a doorway, not touching for long, not saying much, because too much would feel dangerous. Perhaps one says, "Tomorrow, at market." Perhaps the other just nods, and that is enough. Enough to carry through the dark, enough to make the cold lane feel shorter on the walk home, enough to keep a private warmth alive beneath wool blankets and behind shuttered windows, in a world with so little certainty. That kind of promise must have glowed like gold. Now the night deepens, and the story begins to soften around the edges. The bells that once marked the day so firmly seem farther away now, their sound thinner, gentler, as though even they are growing sleepy. The smoke above the rooftops rises more slowly into the dark. The fields beyond the village lie still beneath a thin veil of mist, and the damp stone walls hold the last memory of daylight before surrendering to the cool hush of night. You can let your steps slow here. There is nowhere else you need to be. The hearth fires sink into red embers. The voices indoors fade to murmurs, then to silence. Somewhere a horse shifts in its stall, then settles again. A shutter taps once in the breeze and is still. You carry with you the image of all those hidden little acts of care, a ribbon kept, a bench shared, a walk prolonged by only a few precious steps. Nothing grand, nothing loud, just the steady human wish to be close to someone in a world that is often harsh and watchful. So you let the medieval roads empty, you let the manor halls dim, you let the chapel candles burn low and the distant bells drift farther and farther across the sleeping fields, and as the cold air settles softly over thatched roofs, over muddy lanes, over quiet stables and dark windows, you can rest inside the thought that even here, in this stony and smoke-coloured world, people found ways to love gently. They found ways to signal, to hope, to wait, and to choose one another where they could. And now the village sleeps. The fire is low, the night is kind, and you, having wandered these old roads long enough, can finally grow still with it, while somewhere beyond the last cottage, under the soft dark sky, the secret heart of the medieval world keeps beating quietly on,